This podcast is created for farmers and powered by Pioneer Agronomy to bring you agronomic insights and proven solutions to fuel forward-thinking farming.
Howdy folks, Carl Jorn here, Pioneer Field Agronomist for Northwest Indiana. I am joined as always by my colleagues and co-hosts, Brian Schrader and Ben Jacob. We're pleased to be joined by Danny Brummel. Danny has been on the podcast once before. At that time, we had him discuss kind of the nature of his role and all the things he does for Pioneer. Danny, I'll let you remind folks what that is, but the reason why we wanted to have you on today was recently in the revered Pioneer Agronomy Research Summary book, article number 1, if I'm not mistaken, is what you had just penned here over the last couple months. And as we were getting ready to start up the recording today, you're kind of telling us about your passion for this subject. And so we wanted to take the opportunity to visit with you as a subject matter expert of the history of hybridization in corn and the seed industry in its infancy. So, Danny, welcome to the podcast, and thanks for taking time to join us.
Yeah, thank you, Carl and Ben and Brian. Happy to be here and get to nerd out a little bit about the history of corn. So my title is Agronomy Systems Manager. And so, like you mentioned, the Agronomy Research Summary book, got the opportunity to help out on that, and was very happy to get to write about the history of corn.
So for those of you that have not cracked open your edition of the Agronomy Research Summary book, the title of the article that we're going to be discussing today is A Brief History of Corn from Domestication to 1995. Now, Danny, the softball question I have for you, why did we put the parameters from domestication to 1995? We live in the year 2023. Did you just run out of steam by the end of the article? Or
I just want to give credit quickly, I guess, before I get into everything, but myself and then Dr. Lance Gibson, who's also with Pioneer, he's the agronomy training manager. This is getting to be a pretty long article. We're going to need a stopping point, and we thought 95 would work because 96 is when the commercialization of GE crops really took off. And so we thought, let's cut it, and then maybe we could, this is a little preview, write another article that would cover more of the biotech era. So
awesome.
That's something we're looking at now. It's not official yet, but hopefully we get it going. But yeah, so we're just going to be covering, the article covers the domestication of corn, and then kind of some of the early breeding efforts that took place, and then the hybridization, and then kind of Pioneer's early history and how we became the industry leader through our breeding practices.
You bet. That's great stuff. And thanks for the context there, Danny. We're going to set aside the trait part of the history of the seed industry and really focus on where things got started. And I think that's the coolest part when you think about the story of mankind. A lot of people will kind of begin modern man with the domestication of crop species that led to the beginning of civilization. And so that began somewhere around 10,000 years ago is where we know it today. Here in 100 years, when people are listening to the history of the Indiana Pioneer Agronomy podcast, we might find out that civilization began much earlier, or perhaps not so much earlier than that. But Danny, let's start there. So man began to domesticate grain crops for his betterment, and all of a sudden we find ourselves evaluating corn, not in its state today, but what it once looked like as an ancient grass species. Could we begin the tale of corn at that part?
Yeah, no, I think that would work great. So yeah, we'll start right at the origin. So yeah, the journey of modern corn is a really long one, and somewhere between 10 and 7,000 years at play. And it really started with the domestication of a wild grass that's called teosinte. And if you haven't heard of teosinte, it is basically just what corn was developed from. So it's a totally different plant, but through selective breeding practices that these natives of the area did, they basically, the way I say it, is they created corn, which to me is one of man's greatest inventions. And it was a long process. And so basically what they did is just simple selective breeding techniques where you pick, the plant's seed that has the qualities that you desire, and you just keep planting those seeds. And over time, you start to select for whatever traits that you find important, whether that's taste, look, heights, whatever makes sense. And so basically, they took this plant that looks a lot different than corn and turned it into what we know as corn today.
And so, Danny, if folks haven't looked up what teosinte looks like, it's basically like you said, it's a grass. It's nowhere near the 8 foot tall
Yeah.
deal that we have today. Also not a single-eared species. You wouldn't necessarily call it an ear either. Perhaps there'd be as many as 5 to 12 little kernels that would be on the main stem there. And it's a totally different animal to what it's been bred to meet the needs of man today. The origin, right? Teosinte, a Mexican prairie grass, so somewhere south of
Mhm.
where we all live. I received a book to read over the holidays that, let me make sure I have the title right here, was called The Hybrid Corn Makers, Prophets of Plenty. And that was written by Crabb and Hughes. And I know that was one of the source materials for this, for this, for the article that you guys authored. Now, that was written in 1947 by Rutgers University Press. And at that time, we had no idea where corn had come from. The leading theory was that it originated in the Amazon, and they were still going to find it as we were exploring the Amazon. So our understanding of corn here in just the last 80 years has really, really evolved. But
Mhm.
so we have the origins of corn from that Mexican prairie grass. We went through some selective breeding processes, like you said. You're grabbing the seed from the plants that are most desirable and cultivating them for your own needs. So ideally, maybe a softer textured kernel, maybe a plant that puts on more kernels, more seeds per plant. And over 7 to 10,000 years, we've brought it to what modern corn is today. So you have those corn belt genetics that came from the crossing of the Flint varieties, or the Flint land races, as you said, and then
Mhm.
the Dent southern land races. So when you have those two commingling, all of a sudden we've got kind of a new style of corn, and that is the base of global corn genetics today in terms of feed, fuel, and I guess food production as well. So taking it from that collective pool of landrace varieties, where did where did things kind of go from there?
Yeah, so just a little more about those varieties. Northern Flints were long, skinny um, ears of corn, maybe 8 to 10 rows of kernel wide, where the Southern Dents were short and fat with much more rows of kernels. So when they came together, you kind of got this effect of, hey, now we have these long ears that are wide, have a lot more kernels on them. And so they looked a lot nicer. Okay. And so farmers, or what we call farmer breeders, would start to take these corn belt dent genetics and start to really make their own varieties. And then year after year, they would pick whatever seeds they deemed the best and replant them. And so there were hundreds and thousands of farmer breeders across the country at this time. And there was some that were very successful. The most prominent one would be James Reed, as well as his father. They worked through multiple generations to really develop what they considered the perfect ear of corn. And so James Reed was this renowned farmer breeder located in central Illinois, not too far from Peoria, in the mid 1800s. And so every year they do careful selection of their seed, and eventually they develop what's known as Reed Yellow Dent. So the Reed Yellow Dent corn variety today, I mean, most all the varieties today come from that early genetics. And so Reed really knew what he was doing. He would give the seed that he grew to all of his neighbors as well. That way to limit any cross contamination from corn grown in neighboring fields. and just it was a huge success. It would win corn shows at the Illinois State Fair in 1891. And then a really impressive feat was it went to the World Columbian Exposition in 1893. And so this is the World's Fair. And this was when it was the United States' turn to host it in Chicago. And it won Best Ear there. And some other notable things about that World Fair is, so if you've ever, I'm sure most people know Pabst Blue Ribbon, the beer. So before the fair, it was just Pabst. It won the blue ribbon at that same fair. And that's why it's called Pabst Blue Ribbon. The Ferris wheel was also invented for that World Fair. It was a very interesting time, but that's really where Reed Yellow Dent corn became popular quickly.
And the ice cream cone, right? I think that was another kind of invention or discovery at that waypoint in history.
Yeah, there is just it's almost a limitless list of things that were going on during that World Fair, and there's some really good books on it as well. So it's a very interesting time.
So Danny, Reed's Yellow Dent, I kind of think of as we've begun cultivating this story of corn. Many times as I hear it, you do make this jump from Teosinte, the Mexican prairie grass. Now we're Reed's Yellow Dent. And like you said, we've kind of introduced the selective processes that have led to that point. You touched on a little bit the importance of producing the seed corn crop and limiting its contamination. As I read your article, I think you and Dr. Gibson said somewhere around 3/4 of all of the United States corn production was planted to Reed's Yellow Dent variety of some sort at one point in history. So if you think about from a seed industry person's standpoint, 75% market share is pretty impressive. If you think about the number of acres to one hybrid or one family of varieties, I should say. So we're getting close to the dawn of hybridization and the birth of Pioneer. Brian, Ben, anything that we've covered at this point that you'd like to weigh in on?
Carl, I think it's important to recognize that, and Danny mentioned it, he called them farmer breeders. The idea of cultivating your own corn variety at this point, that was just part of what your process was as a farmer. You did that. You selected for these. There wasn't 3 or 4 folks, at least until the Reed family came along. There weren't 3 or 4 folks across the Corn Belt that were doing this. Everyone did this as a matter of course on their own operation. And it was a different mentality, I think, in terms of what growers were doing, because they weren't only evaluating or taking care of their crop, they were also looking at what was going to be the seed stock for the following year. And in hybridization, that's went away. And so these folks that were farming at this time, I think sometimes in popular culture, these growers from this early time in production agriculture are perhaps portrayed as unsophisticated. And I don't think that's fair to these folks that did this, because they were essentially breeding on their own farm.
Well, and if you think of what characteristics you might select on, depending on how interested you are in your seed stock for the following year, some people may not really start to evaluate that until it's harvest time or until the corn is in the crib, and at that point you're really selecting on the physical appearance of the ear. For those that were more interested, perhaps you follow along during the growing season. Maybe you found a spot in the field that had some really nice emerging plants. Maybe you're selecting for emergence, or maybe stock quality. The stocks that are standing better might be the ones that you prefer to harvest those seed ears for. But I think that's where we're getting into this conversation of how does one make that decision of what is a good ear to take that seed from to make that next year's planting. So Danny, that's kind of where the corn industry was at that point. Before there was truly an industry, it was like Brian said, and you'd stated, these farmer breeders. So where do things go from here?
Yeah, so we had these improved breeding techniques, and they began like I said in the late 1800s. However, they continued to go through the early 1900s, and we talked a lot about physical appearance and change there. There still was a lack of actual yield gain. So the average, the U.S. corn yield average did not change from those late 1800s to the early 1900s during all these improvements, and it stuck right around 20 to 30 bushels an acre. And so this is really when kind of that opportunity struck that, hey, we've improved the appearance of this corn, but we're not really moving along here. And so that's really when the history of Pioneer starts to take place. And what really caused it were what are called corn shows. So these are shows where the 10 most beautiful ears of corn would win a ribbon and the rest wouldn't. And
Okay.
they would sell off those winning ears as seed for a farmer. And so these corn shows or contests were very popular, and they were even promoted by the universities. And the judges would be considered the utmost experts on corn, and they'd give out these really giant trophies or monetary awards, and it was a really big deal. And this is where the story of Henry A. Wallace really begins, who would eventually become the founder of what today is Pioneer. So Henry A. Wallace, at the time of these corn shows being very popular, was a teenager. It is important to note that his father was a very popular professor at Iowa State University, and his grandfather was a owner and operator of a very popular agricultural periodical called Wallace's Farmer. So, his family was very well known in the ag world, especially in the state of Iowa, where he grew up. And so as a teenager, Henry would attend farm shows with his father, and especially ones where Judge P.G. Holden would be the judge. And he was the one who was really responsible for spreading Reed Yellow Dent across the United States. He really saw the value in it. And honestly, without him, the whole industry would look very different today without Holden. And again, he was just extremely well known as being the expert on everything corn. And so Wallace, as a teenager, would go to his corn shows and watch him judge. And, Holden would give these explanations on, oh, these 10 win for this reason and these ones don't for this. And so one day, the teenager raised his hand and asked Holden in front of everybody. He goes, well, what does a hog care how a ear of corn looks? What, yield should be most important. Why do we care what it looks like? And how do you know from the appearance that it's going to yield more if you plant it the next year? And so I just always think that's funny when I read that, thinking of a teenager, kind of going out toe to toe with the expert on corn. But he was a family friend, and so Holden started listing off all these reasons why this corn would be better than next. And Wallace, he didn't really, he didn't trust his answer. He didn't believe it. And so his father, as well as Holden, went on to suggest that he try a little experiment in his backyard just so he could learn, plant the winning ears alongside the losing ears to see what yielded better. And so Wallace went ahead and did that. He took about 50 ears in all, 25 that had won awards of some sort, and 25 that ranked near the lowest, and planted them in his backyard in Des Moines, covering about 3 acres of his family's land. So he spent the summer just taking care of those plots, collecting all sorts of data. And then at the end, he collected the yield data from that 3-acre plot. And surprisingly, at least for the industry, the highest yielding corn did not come from any of the award-winning ears, but in fact came from one of the lowest ranking ears in the whole contest. And taking the average of the yields for those 2 different groups, the lower ranking ears actually had a higher average yield than the highest ranking ears. And so this really challenged the conventional thinking at the time by demonstrating that, hey, there's no relationship between the appearance of these ears and yield. And Wallace would continue to go on and kind of mock these corn shows as pseudoscience, and really started to promote what are today called yield contests. So Wallace was really a proponent of starting what we have today as, yield contests. And that's when the invention of hybrid corn really starts to begin. So,
Danny, at this waypoint, I guess just a lighthearted remark, but for those of you that have angsty teenagers at home that are challenging you on everything that you know and hold close and dear, perhaps if they are challenging the conventional thinking, maybe they are onto something, but make them go ahead and do the work all summer to prove it to you, and either we'll all be the wiser and better for it, or they'll learn a valuable lesson of listening to their elders and the value of hard work. But that aside, so Danny said we've reached this point, this kind of transition of challenging the conventional thinking, and we've got a field experiment proving the point that yes, the appearance of an ear is not the end all be all, and yield is what paid the bills back then, fed the hogs, and what it does today. So where do things go from here?
yeah, so this takes us to the invention of hybrid corn, which I myself consider one of the greatest inventions of humankind, and I'm very honored that it actually took place in the United States as well. But there are many different scientists that contributed to this invention, and I'm not going to go through them all, but there was a couple that I didn't get to talk about in the article that I just like to mention quickly. So Charles Darwin, he's considered actually the great grandfather of hybrid corn by Henry A. Wallace. So well before he started writing theories on evolution and natural selection, Darwin wrote a book on cross and self-pollination way back in 1876. And he actually observed and had decent notes on hybrid vigor identified in the corn plant. Didn't take yield, didn't really get any data, but he kind of, got that snowball rolling, as you'd say. And about at the same time, Gregory Mendel, who was an Austrian monk, basically discovered the science of genetics and breeding with his pea experiments in his large garden. And so those two things happened at a similar time, and then the snowball kept rolling, and William James Beale of Michigan State University became the first to cross-fertilize corn for the sole purpose of increasing yield. And he took notes on that. So those were really three big players. But the big breakthrough came from two independent professors that were studying self-pollinating of corn. One was Edward East, and the other was George Scholl. And so they were both up in the northeastern part of the country, near New York. And they both quickly noticed that once inbreeding the corn plant, through a couple generations, the vigor really decreases as well as the yield. And then so Joel took it a little bit further, and even with those inbred lines that were crossed and were less vigorous, he decided he'd go ahead and create hybrids from those different inbreds. And that's where the big shock came for him, was that, hey, these inbreds had much greater yield than their inbred parents, but also most of the time would have a greater yield than the variety that those inbreds were developed from. And even more important than that was they'd be consistent. Where we have open pollinated varieties, each corn plant's genetically a little bit different. But with these hybrids that they were creating, they're pretty darn similar. And so that's when hybrid corn, so to speak, was born. If you're interested in learning more about that process, for this research I did, I read many different books. One of them was Corn and Its Early Fathers, and it was actually written by Henry A. Wallace and William L. Brown, who was a previous president to Pioneer. And they covered kind of what we've talked about so far, but really going in depth onto different farmer breeders and these scientists. But that's where this book ends, and where the adoption of hybrid corn really begins in the United States.
Danny, I just got a kick out when I was learning about, the infancy of hybrid corn and the inbreeding process. You think about it, the story of corn, you mentioned Iowa and central Illinois, but then all of a sudden where there's a couple of professors in the northeast portion of the country, not where we think of the corn acres today. And that if you can imagine being, like a Dr. McPhee department head, but 50 years earlier, 90 years earlier, you've got, this professor that's working on a project where he's telling you, hey, I'm inbreeding corn and it's now less vigorous and it doesn't yield as much. And you're thinking, do I want to keep contributing to that program? Is there maybe a different idea that we should pursue? But like you said, when we get from that inbreeding to hybridization from those inbreds, that's where the leaps and bounds are gained. And it wasn't leaps and bounds in terms of adoption of hybrid corn, and I think that's where you're going to take this conversation next. But yeah, quite the journey that took place here 120 years ago, from the birth of inbreeding corn to hybridization, and then the commercialization of hybrid corn. So where does that story make the transition?
Yeah, so we're going back to Henry A. Wallace now, and after he finished school at Iowa State College, which it was at the time, he actually went to a lecture by Edward East, one of those scientists we talked about up in the Northeast that was conducting those experiments on hybrid corn. And Wallace was convinced pretty early on. And so he started breeding hybrid corn in the 1920s and just started doing lots of different experiments on 40 acres of farmland that was purchased by his wife, actually, his wife's inheritance, Ilo, in Johnston, Iowa. And so that's really where that pioneer story, it starts. So in 1923, Wallace took one of his first hybrids, which was called the Copper Cross, and he put it into the Iowa State yield test. And it won. And I believe it continued to win year after year. And so the continued success of the hybrids that Wallace was producing kind of convinced them that, hey, I need to bring on some new human and financial resources into this potential business. And so with the help of several friends, the Hybrid Corn Company was organized and incorporated in Iowa on April 20th, 1926. And so this was the first company devoted solely to the production of hybrid seed, and was the predecessor of Pioneer Hybrid. So they eventually changed their name, but it started off as the Hybrid Corn Company because there was none other. So that goes on, and this is kind of where I stop, where Wallace's history kind of stops as far as Pioneer goes. He goes on to do lots of things, and no person was more important to commercialization and farmer acceptance of hybrid corn than Henry A. Wallace was. Very few people in the world recognized the potential from hybrid corn. And if you don't know much about Wallace, he went on and became U.S. Secretary of Agriculture by Franklin D. Roosevelt. And then after that, he was actually elected Vice President of the United States in 1940. And then after that, he got cheated out of the election, in my opinion, by Truman. And he went to Secretary of Commerce instead of Vice President. And then Roosevelt died. Truman became president. So if you read some history on him, he was about 24 hours away from becoming the president of the United States. He'd go on to run for president and was unsuccessful and do lots of crazy experiments with strawberries and flowers. And he actually produced a very strong egg breeding or chicken breeding company with his son. But he did a lot of fascinating things. But yeah, so he.
And if I'm not mistaken, Danny, we're talking about the commercialization of hybrid corn, and as an industry, it was obviously in its infancy, and so part of the challenges that we still face today, when you bring on a new hybrid, you can only produce so much, and the limitations are based on that inbred parent seed stock, and so the adoption rate in which can take place of hybrid corn is limited by how much one could produce, and you'd mentioned that Henry Wallace, coming from that, Wallace's Weekly Heritage, or Wallace's Farmer, that publication and its heritage. He was a very strong advocate just for hybrid corn, period, let alone, hybrid corn from the Hybrid Corn Company. And so I know he's very instrumental in terms of I guess, encouraging other companies to be established, like Lester Feaster of Feaster Hybrids and the Funk family, making their transition from varietal corn to hybrid corn, and obviously there's too many to name, but that just an advocate for this modern adoption of this the advent of hybrid corn. So you'd mentioned Copper Cross. Copper Cross came to us by two inbreds, obviously. One of those was Bloody Butcher, which if you ever look that corn up, it's distinctly, blood red, like the name suggests. And then it was crossed with a Leeming hybrid, which I think came out of the East program there at the University of Connecticut Research Station. So you had those two together, and it was named Copper Cross because sure enough, it didn't look like a yellow corn. It looked more like copper corn because of the influence of that Bloody Butcher inbred. A fun note for folks at home, if you think about their cost of seed today is more than what it once was. Copper Cross, when first sold 99 years ago, that would have gone for $1 per pound. And so if you were to do the math, the arithmetic here with me, $1 per pound in 1924 dollars taken across to 2023, that would cost you somewhere around $850 a bag. So yes, the cost of inputs is going up in agriculture, but I don't think it has kept pace with what how hybrid seed corn first came out with a bang. So Danny, we kind of talked about the beginning of the hybrid seed corn company. What is left to tell about the story of hybrid corn and its commercialization that we haven't had a chance to touch on today?
Yeah. So, and you kind of mentioned a little bit, but the adoption of hybrid corn was it was a challenge to get farmers to adopt this new type of corn. One, they were not accustomed to buying seed at all for each, especially for every year. And the seed was very expensive to produce. It was in very short supply. However, it's kind of unique how a chain of events worked here, but the experience of the Dust Bowl from the years of the 1934 to 1940 really demonstrated the value of hybrid corn and how vastly superior to open pollinated varieties it was under severe drought. And so Pioneer's big first product was Pioneer 307, and it was due to its drought tolerance. It produced double the yield as any of the open pollinated varieties on the market, and it really kind of started farmer adoption. And so in 1936, about 10% of all acres in Iowa were hybrids. And 2 years later, in 1938, just over half of all acres were hybrids. And then in 1942, virtually all acres of corn were hybrid corn. And so it was significant. It was very quick, and quickly the hybridization of other agricultural crops followed suit, including canola, rice, sorghum, sunflowers, and wheat. So that takes us really through that adoption phase of, okay, I'm not used to buying seed. What is this? To everybody seeing the benefits and it just becoming virtually the only type of corn planted.
Yeah, so the adoption was moving at a snail's pace as you're ramping up the seed stock you have to supply. But like you said, hybridization demonstrated that those hybrids of the 1930s were a lot tougher than what the landrace varieties would have been. So you have that high adoption rate. One thing that I guess I think we all kind of find interesting is the hybrid corn company really invested specifically in developing that germplasm, and there were more than just Pioneer, I guess, in this commercial corn space, but who were some of the other entities that were also in the pursuit of breeding hybrids, to kind of maybe speak to what the diversity looks like today versus what it would have back in the 40s, 50s, 60s.
Yeah, so it was a lot different than it is today, where you had mostly universities that were developing inbred lines. as well as farmer breeders still were working on producing inbreds that they'd sell. And then they would be picked up by certain hybrid corn companies and produced as a hybrid product. But that's where kind of Pioneer was the exception, to where they were early adopters to developing their own inbreds. And that was really taken up by a breeding project started in 1942 by Raymond Baker. And Baker was the second employee ever hired by Henry A. Wallace. And so much of Pioneer's success that we've seen, kind of through the 1970s to the 80s to the 90s, was due to that early investment in inbred development by Pioneer, and specifically Raymond Baker.
So that investment in developing your own inbred lines versus if you were a seed supplier of that day, but you're sourcing your inbreds, the best that a Missouri or University of Illinois or, Iowa State could have provided at that time. You get to build out more diversity. And that's something that we still tout pretty heavily, is that, what you can find in a Pioneer bag is exclusive to Pioneer because our seed stock, our inbreds, our germplasm, our genetic pool is proprietary to us. Whereas, take a DeKalb as an example. If you're sourcing, some of the inbreds that were bred from the Missouri program, you could certainly breed that with one of your own internally developed inbreds, but you've only got half of that, which is unique to you. And so at the time, there was a lot of, I guess, shared genetics that were planted out there because you lean so heavily on those public lines, and they don't have those unique characteristics. And that's a line that can still be drawn through to today, and a really unique advantage when it comes to, seed from a germplasm standpoint. So yeah, a fun note for since this is the Indiana Pioneer Agronomy podcast. Purdue was very hesitant to jump into the space of breeding corn, and at most other state colleges, the agronomy department was who took those, who took on those professorial roles or the research roles from the experiment station. But at Purdue, they said, hey, not interested. And so that's why the breeding programs within Purdue University, they're housed within the botany department, as opposed to the agronomy department. So I don't know that anybody found that fact interesting, but that is why that's why it is the way it is. So yeah, Danny, what have we not discussed in terms of hybrid corn?
Yeah, so I'd say the next really big development would have been in the 1970s with the switch from double cross hybrids to what we call single cross hybrids. So prior to the 1970s, these hybrids that we've been mentioning, they were not the product of one inbred or two inbred parents and one hybrid progeny. They were actually developed from 4 separate inbred lines to make 2 hybrids, and then take those 2 hybrids to make what we call a double cross hybrid. And it really comes down to that short seed supply. If you've ever been through an inbred field, which I know probably many people haven't, they're not too pretty looking, and you don't get a lot of kernels on an ear of corn. But back in the 1930s, it was much worse, and there just was not enough seed to produce single cross hybrids like there is today. And so one of the big advancements that happened was at Iowa State University with inbred that they created, known as stiff stalk synthetics, which basically was a female inbred that would produce enough kernels to make single cross hybrids efficient. And this led to a lot more consistency in the hybrid product. And so you also mentioned, these other companies taking university-derived inbreds. And so the whole industry was using these stiff stalk synthetics, these inbreds made by Iowa State University that could make single cross hybrids. And then almost all companies were taking inbred lines made either by University of Missouri or the University of Ohio and combining them to make a product. And as we mentioned, Pioneer took a different approach by heavily investing in its own inbred line development. And so that's what led to Pioneer Hybrid's rapid expansion in the corn market share. And so just to go over some kind of big moments of that rapid expansion, in the 1980s, basically everybody noticed how Pioneer was leading, in the era of university-derived corn inbreds really passed at that time. Everybody was trying to catch up and develop their own inbred lines. And that really allowed Pioneer market share to continue to expand during that time, especially with the Pioneer brand hybrid 3394 in the early 1990s. This hybrid became so dominant in the mid-90s that by itself, it outsold the entire hybrid lineup of all competitor seed companies. So that, I think that really shows that, hey, that development of inbred lines early on by Ray Baker really paid off.
Yeah, the idea of how many inbreds our breeders have to work with today, I don't think I'm giving anything away proprietarily here, but it is north of that 500 million mark, in terms of how many inbreds we have characterized, and that means it's more than just what's written on a sheet of paper and the pedigree lineage there. It's a pretty impressive library, very comprehensive, and gives our folks a lot of tools in the proverbial toolbox to say this trait here is important. Well, we know from where in that genetic universe to pull that type of stock. And so yeah, and I'm sure Danny had mentioned the transition from the double cross to single cross hybrids, but at one point that was thought to never ever be within the realm of possibility, just because two inbreds crossed together would produce such a small ear that it wouldn't be economically viable to be able to influence a purchase decision for a farmer to be interested in that. Just the production efficiencies would just be so little, and so that's why you had the hybrid by hybrid cross to get the double cross hybrids of old. But yeah, through the improvement in producibility, how we understand how to raise hybrid seed corn from an inbred phase to getting packed into a Pioneer bag, that's been where we've been able to overcome what once was thought to be impossible. Danny, I know in your article you also referenced that hybrid corn adoption, as it was seen as such an impressive, I guess, adoption of that technology, that it was actually used as a case study in many Masters of Business Administration programs, 20, 30 years ago. I found that to be a really interesting note, as many folks that I guess their lives are so different today than they were 100 years ago because of the advent of modern corn. I just think that's really cool, and I know you said that it might be the most impressive invention, or at least your personal favorite. But yeah, it's kind of a cool way to look at this whole story here.
Yeah, no, like you said, it was used colleges all over as a case study. And I was just doing some reading the other day, and I saw that Times Magazine, I believe back in the 1980s, put the adoption of hybrid corn as one of the greatest feats of humankind in the last 1,000 years. So it was definitely recognized, and I try to be optimistic, but unfortunately, I feel like it's not as appreciated or known about as it should. So I'm really hopeful that this article kind of helps promote that feat of Pioneer, but also just humankind and the United States in general.
Yeah, most definitely. Well, I know we just covered 9,000 years of history in under an hour's time. So, Danny, I want to say thank you for serving as our subject matter expert. I know through this discussion you shared that you are an avid reader. So, what other books would you have on your reading list for folks that have the green thumb, are farmers, or naturalists, conservationists at heart, much like yourself? What might you encourage them to pick up off of their local library?
Yeah, so to cover the material that went over today, and it's, again, I'm an ag nerd. I really enjoy going through all this different material, but a lot of this information I couldn't find online. I had to dig through lots of different paper sources, including books. And some of my highlights would be one, I already mentioned Corn and its Early Fathers, written by Henry A. Wallace and William L. Brown. If you want to know more about the life of Henry A. Wallace, which is a very fascinating life, which includes this, but much more things as well. American Dreamer, A Life of Henry A. Wallace is another great book. I think you mentioned this one, Carl, too, but the Hybrid Corn Makers, published by Rutgers University Press. And then I think I have another one on my bookshelf here. Corn and Corn Growing, which is also by Henry A. Wallace. And reading books by him are just a lot of fun because he really likes corn, and he has some great quotes in here. If you don't mind, I wrote a couple that I think are just kind of pretty neat. So he in the Corn Makers book, he wrote, "Corn was the bridge by which pioneers crossed America." I just thought, what a line. He also says, "Corn is much more plausibly the symbol of the United States than the bald eagle." So,
That's a good one.
so you can see how passionate he is about the subject. So it's fun reading books when there's lines like that scattered throughout them.
You bet. That's fantastic. Well, Danny, thank you for your time. I know that we all could have, we could cover this subject in even greater detail as we just tried to provide the highlights, from the article that you had penned with Lance Gibson. So thank you for sharing some of your knowledge. I hope the folks on the other ends of these microphones enjoyed it as much as we did. And so if people do have follow-up questions or are looking for more reading recommendations from Danny Brummel, where may they reach out and follow along?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn, and I actually do quite a bit of posts on there. And I know not a lot of people use it, but I like it. I'm new to Twitter. If you want to find me, Danny Brummel on Twitter. I have maybe 100 followers, so if you want to help me increase that number, go ahead.
There you go.
And I do some nerdy posts about ag history from time to time.
Excellent. That's great. Ben, Brian, I know you guys are both history wonks as well and passionate about this subject. Anything we didn't have a chance to breathe some life into today that you wanna cover?
I'd just highlight how fast this transition took place. I feel, and Danny kind of mentioned this, or you mentioned it about early farmers. I feel like agriculture in general gets kind of pigeonholed as being maybe antiquated in a lot of ways, but this was one of the more rapid modernizations across the world. And if you think from the 1870s, I don't recall exactly which year, from Gregor Mendel, discovering or describing basic inheritance, to around 2010, we had the entire maize genome mapped, and utilizing molecular markers and advanced breeding technologies for that to take place in 2 lifetimes, essentially, is really incredible. With all the other smaller but not less significant advancements throughout that time period. It's really been an incredible journey if you start breaking it down about how rapidly it happened, and how you didn't have to just you had to change the culture to make this happen, and cultural changes tend to be slow. So I think that I have an innate appreciation for the significance of this, and I hope that others do as well.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ben. Ryan?
I just would echo Ben's comments. I think the other thing too is that folks in agriculture, we tend to be a bit of a sentimental group. And so, one of the things that I think is interesting is, as you read through Danny's article and you think about our campus in Johnston, how the company has honored many of the folks that are mentioned in this article with their own buildings, or wings on buildings, or whatever it might be. We want to honor that history that we've talked about today, and I think we do a pretty good job of it. The other thing I would mention is that a lot of these products that Danny calls out in the article, and we've talked about 3394, just how foundational not only to Pioneer, but also to the industry as a whole. And that would be an entirely different podcast to get into everything about 3394. But just because of the dominance of that hybrid, that thing genetically, for the most part, is scattered out throughout the corn industry now. And so just how foundational not only to Pioneer, but really corn production overall, that particular product was.
One thing I'd like to add on is, if anybody, finds himself in Johnston, Iowa, we do have a history of corn plot, which was kind of the baby to this article, where we have teosinte growing, we have those early land races of Northern Flints and Southern Dents growing. We have some of those early hybrids to what we have today. So it's really cool to, walk 100 feet and see this 9,000 year journey just right in front of you. So it's pretty cool.
Great contribution. Thanks, Danny. Well, guys, this has been a fun discussion. Perfect for your travels if you're heading to the beach this winter, if you're making your journey back to the great state of Indiana, or if you're looking for some reading material as you enjoy the southerly climes. But Ben, if folks want to see what's going on in West Central Indiana and follow along with your musings, where may they do so?
Yep, you can find me on Twitter at the Ben Jacob, or on Facebook at Ben Jacob Agronomy. Mr. Schrader, how about you?
You can find me on Instagram, B_K_Schrader. And Carl, how about you?
And if you want to see what's taking place in Northwest Indiana, you can do so on Twitter at CJORN, that's CJOERN, or on Facebook at CJORN Agronomy. With that, hope you enjoyed this edition of the Indiana Pioneer Agronomy Podcast. We once again thank Daniel Brummel for his contributions to today's discussion, and I look forward to visiting with Danny again sometime soon. Until we visit with you next time, stay safe, and we will talk to you then.
Thank you for listening to this episode from the Pioneer Agronomy team. Be sure to visit pioneer.com/podcasts to access additional episodes and learn more about our extensive on-farm data and innovative digital tools that are fueling forward-thinking farming.